He never took Jerusalem, the king who crossed half the world to reach it, who sold everything he owned to fund the journey, who fought the greatest Muslim commander of the age to a standstill, and brought that army to the edge of collapse. He stood 12 miles from the walls, twice, and twice he turned back. This is not a story of triumph. It is not a story of failure. It is something rarer and harder than either, the story of a man who was right about everything, won almost every battle, and still could not reach the one thing he had come for. Some distances cannot be closed by courage alone. Drawn from history. Before he was a man, he was a legend. Kings feared him, poets followed him. His own enemies gave him a name they meant as warning, and he wore as a crown. The Lionheart. In an age when most rulers led from behind walls and strategy, Richard of England fought from the front, personally, physically, with the kind of ferocity that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe without sounding like they were writing mythology. He was the king who rode through Saladin's lines at Arsuf and came back. He was the king who walked the walls of besieged cities to personally inspect the damage, while arrows fell around him. He was the king whose very arrival at a siege changed the mathematics of it, not because of his army's numbers, but because of what his presence did to the men on both sides of the walls. The legend was real, every word of it. That made what came next so much harder to understand. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187. The news traveled west like a wound, court to court, city to city, until it reached every kingdom in Christendom. For medieval Europe, Jerusalem was not a city. It was the center of the universe, the place where God had walked in human form. Its loss didn't feel like a military defeat. It felt like the sky had cracked. Richard heard the news in France and took his Crusader vow the same day, before his own father agreed to go, before anything was organized. He heard that Jerusalem was lost, and his response was immediate and total. He was going. He spent 3 years turning that decision into an army. He sold castles, offices, land. He famously said he would have sold London itself if he could find a buyer. He raised a fleet of over 100 ships, organized supply chains, planned logistics with a precision that surprised people who'd only heard of him as a warrior. The warrior part was real, but it was only half the story. He arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191 with something the Crusade had been lacking for 2 years: momentum. The siege of Acre had been grinding since 1189, Crusaders besieging the city, Saladin besieging the Crusaders, both sides exhausted and starving in a brutal stalemate. Richard arrived, established a naval blockade, resumed the bombardment, and within 5 weeks the city surrendered. 5 weeks, after 2 years. Saladin's chronicler watched the Lionheart's fleet arrive from the shore and wrote about it with what can only be described as dread. The Muslim garrison inside Acre watched those sails appear on the horizon and understood immediately what they meant. The city surrendered on July 12th. Then Richard made a decision that would follow him for 8 centuries. Saladin had agreed to ransom the garrison, gold, Christian prisoners, the relic of the true cross. The deadlines passed, the payments didn't come. Richard's advisors told him Saladin was stalling deliberately, keeping the Crusader army anchored in Acre, while his own forces recovered strength in the hills above the city. Richard looked at his army. He looked at the hills where Saladin was watching and waiting. He ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners. He had given Saladin every opportunity to prevent it. The ransoms were not delivered. What happened next on that plain outside Acre has been argued over ever since. Was it justice under the rules of medieval warfare? Was it a massacre? Was it a strategic calculation made by a man who understood that a stationary army dies slowly? The argument has never been settled, and perhaps it shouldn't be. History doesn't offer clean verdicts on moments like this. It only offers the moment itself, and the weight of it landing on one man's shoulders. Saladin, watching from the hills, never forgot what he saw, and he never stopped using it to sharpen everything that came after. The march south from Acre toward Jaffa is one of the most disciplined military operations in the entire medieval period. Saladin threw everything he had at it. Horse archers harassed the column constantly, riding close, firing, retreating, circling back, day after day. The heat was brutal and relentless. The road was narrow. Richard's soldiers marched with arrows embedded in their backs, and they were ordered not to break formation to chase the riders. They didn't. They marched, they bled, they kept walking, and Saladin watched all of it, calculating, searching for the break in the line that would allow him to shatter the column the way he had shattered every Crusader army before this one. On September 7th, at a place called Arsuf, he committed everything, the full army, every reserve, the sound of it, drums, war cries, the thunder of cavalry, rolled across the plain like something the earth itself was producing. The Hospitallers in the rear guard took the worst of it. They held as long as men can hold when everything behind them is collapsing. Then, without orders, they broke and charged. Richard had not given the signal. He watched the charge begin. He watched the gap it created. He watched Saladin's flanks begin to shift, to exploit the break. And in the space of a few seconds, he made the decision that separated him from almost every commander of his age. He didn't try to pull them back. He ordered the entire line forward. What had been an undisciplined break became a coordinated assault across the full width of the field. Saladin's army, moving to exploit a gap that suddenly no longer existed, found itself absorbing a charge it hadn't prepared for. The line shattered. Richard rode through the breaking Muslim formation personally, and the accounts of what his sword cut through that afternoon read like men searching for words adequate to what they witnessed. It was the first major field defeat Saladin had ever suffered. That night, Richard camped 12 miles closer to Jerusalem, and for the first time the city felt reachable. Then, the campaign began to die. Not from enemy action, from the weight of everything else pressing down simultaneously. The French contingent fractured along political lines that had nothing to do with the Crusade. Back in England, his brother John was moving against the throne Richard had emptied his treasury to defend. The supply lines to Jerusalem stretched thin across hostile territory. The city sat inland, away from the sea, defensible by Saladin indefinitely as long as the Sultan held Egypt and controlled the roads between them. Richard called his council the Templars, the Hospitallers, the lords who had lived in this land for years, who knew every road and every water source and every way an army could be destroyed between the coast and the walls. They told him the same thing, all of them, without disagreement. An advance now would end in catastrophe. They would arrive at the walls exhausted, their supply lines cut, surrounded by an enemy who had spent the winter recovering everything he had lost at Arsuf. Jerusalem was not a city you could take with a broken army and no water. Richard listened to every word. He knew they were right. He turned back. The army didn't understand. They had come from every kingdom in Europe for this. They were 12 miles away. They could see the hills the city sat behind. And their king was turning them around. Some of them wept openly in the road, not from fear, from grief. Richard refused to look back at the city as they marched. He raised his shield to block his own view. He had sworn he would enter Jerusalem only as its conqueror, and he could not make himself look at something he was not yet able to take. He kept his face forward. He kept walking. He tried again the following summer. The army reached the same hills, the same distance, 12 miles. The scouts came back with reports that Saladin had systematically destroyed every water source along the remaining route. The garrison inside the city had been reinforced. The Sultan himself was there, inside the walls, waiting with the patience of a man who had understood from the beginning that time was his greatest weapon. Again the council, again the same conclusion from the same experienced men. 12 miles, no water, Saladin between them and safety. It wasn't Jerusalem they would be marching into. It was Hattin, the catastrophe that had destroyed the Crusader kingdom 5 years earlier. Armies surrounded, waterless, annihilated, repeated on the same ground, for the same reason, by the same enemy who had studied every mistake his opponents ever made. Richard sat with it. Then he turned back again. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin signed a truce. The truce left the Christian coast intact and reopened Jerusalem to Christian pilgrims. Even Saladin privately admitted that the Christians had grown strong again. Richard sailed for home on October 9th. He had been in the Holy Land for 2 years. He would never return. For 8 centuries, history remembered one thing about Richard the Lionheart, that he stood 12 miles from Jerusalem and did not take it. Not that every experienced man in the Holy Land agreed with his decision, not that the military orders confirmed his judgment, not that the alternative was almost certain annihilation. History remembered the distance, the 12 miles, the thing he came for and couldn't reach. But here is what those 12 miles actually were. They were the distance between what a man wants and what the world will allow him to have, between courage and possibility, between the legend he was and the reality he lived inside. He turned back. He raised a shield so he wouldn't have to see what he was leaving behind. And somewhere in that gesture, a king blocking his own view of the city he had crossed the world to reach, is everything this story is actually about. Not the battles he won, not the miles he marched, not the legend that followed him across 8 centuries. Just a man on a road, shield raised against the horizon, carrying the full weight of the right decision. Alone. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please subscribe and leave a like. You can also write in the comments which historical topics you'd like to see next. See you in the next video.